Tonight on Nova, we continue a major series on one of medicine's most important and glamorous fields. A story of adventure, controversy, and the pioneers of surgery. This week, these twins and the first kidney transplant paved the way for surgeons to trade new organs for old.
Funding for Nova is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying health care products worldwide. And Prime Computer, supplying integrated computer solutions to the world's manufacturing, commercial, technical, and scientific marketplaces. Major funding for Nova is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide.
After the Second World War, surgery entered a golden age, with heart surgery leading the way. In 20 years, a group of daring pioneers achieved almost all of their goals, and their success affected all of surgery. By 1966, the heart surgeons were ready to take on the one outstanding problem that remained: how to replace the heart itself. Most, like Dr. Michael DeBakey, thought that the answer would lie in implanting artificial hearts. But the future was destined to lie in a different direction, in replacing the old diseased organ with a new one, a heart transplant. There is a legend that the two saints Cosmas and Damian once performed an operation on a man whose cancerous leg had to be amputated. With the sanction of God, they transplanted the leg of a recently dead black slave onto the patient's body.
According to the legend, this initial transplant was a complete success, and far too many people in the operating theatre. And this is members of the media of that day coming for an exclusive interview before the operation is even quite completed, which is rather typical of the story of transplantation.
For most of its history, surgery has been concerned with repairing wounds and removing diseased parts. But from time to time, the dream of reconstructing and replacing parts has surfaced. In the 16th century, victims of duels who had lost their noses sometimes went to the Italian surgeon Tagliacozzi, who grafted back skin to reconstruct the missing part. But such procedures only worked with skin from the patient's own body. There seemed to be a problem with grafts from other people or from animals. Even with blood, early attempts to transfuse from animals were disastrous, and human-to-human transfusions only became safe when blood groups were identified in the 20th century. Over 80 years ago, the Franco-American surgeon Alexis Carrel went still further. Years ahead of his time, he transplanted kidneys and hearts between animals and between different animal species, but always they ended in failure. It wasn't until the Second World War that the mystery was properly explained. Airmen were brought in with massive burns. In previous wars, they would have died. Now, medical care could keep them alive long enough to get them to the hospital. The surgeons were presented with a terrible problem.
Well, burns were a great source of casualty and cause of death. Soldiers would be burned 50 or 60% of their body and come in off the battlefield casually asking for a cigarette. Yet they knew, or the surgeons knew, that that person would be dead within 24 or 48 hours because you couldn't survive. So what we needed was a way to remove the skin from a person and give them literally a new suit of skin.
This was the problem taken up by a young British scientist, Peter Medawar. In the early 1940s, he was dispatched to a special burns unit in Glasgow to investigate whether lives could be saved by grafting new skin.
The burned patient can have such a big burn that there isn't any of his own skin left to cover him with. As you know, you can take your skin from the back of your hand and put it on the back of the other hand, a transplant within your own body, and it takes perfectly well. There's no problem. But Gibson and Medawar were interested in trying to make this better by, amongst other things, taking skin, let's say, from the patient's brother, or maybe from a recently deceased person, from a cadaver, and putting it on.
Working under Tom Gibson, a plastic surgeon, Medawar tried to cover the burn with skin from another person, but it simply didn't work. Over a period of about 7 days, it shriveled up and flaked off.
Their initial object was to hope to try to take skin from someone else and cover the burned patient. Medawar saw that that didn't work, though, so he went to the laboratory and he described what became known as the second set response, which showed that this was an immunologic process. If you take two animals and you put skin from one animal onto the second animal, the first set is rejected in about 7 to 9 days. But what Medawar discovered, and so much of science is really beautifully simple, that the second graft was rejected in about 4 days and sometimes immediately. That the second set suggested that there'd been an immunologic sensitivity built up. And from that, Medawar, who later, of course, was knighted, won the Nobel Prize for this work along with several other people, showed that this was what we call an immunogenetic response.
Medawar had shown that it was impossible to transplant skin from one person to another. Rejection was an unavoidable immunological process. The body treated the graft as if it was an unwelcome virus, like a cold. And what was true for skin would be equally true for anything else that the surgeon might want to transplant.
Now, the rejection of skin is immunologically, biochemically, and biologically exactly like the rejection of a kidney, a heart, a liver, or whatever. So they were looking at the immunology of transplantation.
So, paradoxical though it may seem, the rejection of an organ graft, something which the surgeon most fears, is essentially the body curing itself of the graft. The graft is treated as if it were a disease, and rejection is the cure of that disease.
It seemed as if the legend of Cosmas and Damian was scientifically flawed. Separating all individuals was a barrier, and it appeared unbreachable. The same barrier which prevented the treatment of burns victims also worked against other war casualties. The victims of bomber raids trapped under fallen buildings sometimes developed crush syndrome, where their kidneys went into acute failure. The barrier that prevented a skin graft prevented a kidney transplant too. And outside of war, countless thousands suffered from incurable kidney disease. To accept Medawar's barrier was a counsel of despair. A way had to be found to breach it. A small hospital in Boston, the Peter Bent Brigham, would pioneer this effort. Located in the medical capital of the world and part of the Harvard Medical School, a team of research-minded physicians and surgeons decided to have a try at transplanting kidneys. Without any real knowledge of rejection and no way of fighting it, they began surgically transplanting kidneys. They put them into the thigh, where they could be removed easily if something went wrong, leaving the patient's own damaged kidneys in place. The kidneys usually came from cadavers, and the urine they made drained out through a tube. Most of these early cases died of tissue rejection, but 1 or 2 survived for surprising lengths of time. And in these cases, the terrible effects of renal disease were completely reversed.
The most dramatic was a young doctor that came up from Peru, I believe, certainly from South America, who had a thigh transplant, which functioned for 5.5 months very well. And we had a plastic bag, like you have for colostomies, collecting the urine, because the urine came right out the thigh. And he wore this bag, and I remember he used to take the subway downtown with his plastic bag tacked onto his thigh. That kidney was finally rejected at about just under 6 months. But it was a tremendously stimulating experience because it somehow seemed that this could work.
What made it possible to keep patients alive until a cadaver kidney turned up was this machine, the artificial kidney. It had been invented in Nazi-occupied Holland during the war by a young Dutch doctor, Willem Kolff. It was amazingly simple, a long tube of cellophane, like a sausage skin, wrapped around a large drum. The drum went into a bath filled with salts and water, the dialyzing fluid. Then, by slowly turning the drum, the blood of the patient worked its way along the tube where it was cleansed of waste products, just like a real kidney.
This is a dialyzing membrane. It looks like a ribbon, but actually it's a tube. So the blood is inside that tube, and when the blood is inside the tube, small molecules go through the membranes of the tube and are washed away by the dialyzing fluid. This is called dialysis, okay? And at the same time, electrolytes such as sodium, potassium, chloride, and so on are in the dialyzing fluid. They go both in and out. So an equilibrium is formed between the electrolytes of the patient and the electrolytes of the dialyzing fluid. So when the sodium of the patient is too high, it is automatically reduced, and when the sodium is too low, it's automatically brought to the normal level.
In 14 hours, it could remove vast quantities of waste urea and restore a patient to health. Kolff's machine was modified and spread throughout the world. To the team in Boston, the artificial kidney was to be indispensable in their quest to transplant kidneys.
Well, this is what's happened to it. Sic transit gloria. This is the first artificial kidney that was ever run in the United States. And here it's ended up in the junk pile. But this was the apparatus that enabled us to maintain patients in good health, patients with chronic kidney failure, until we could get transplants for them. I think it's a reasonable thing to say that without this thing, transplantation never would have gotten started, because in the early days, before we knew much about it, we couldn't take live donors. We had to use cadaver donors. And therefore, of course, we had to keep the patients in good shape with this old rotating barrel until a cadaver came along.
But still, a way had to be found of overcoming rejection. Naively, the Boston team even tried transplanting kidneys in a plastic bag in the hope that it would help.
Well, there are a lot of philosophical questions about that. The statement is often made that we couldn't do that work now. It would be outlawed by the Human Subjects Committee or the Federal Food and Drug Administration. Maybe so, but those patients were suffering badly. They certainly needed a try.
The Boston surgeons weren't alone. In Paris, 2 teams decided to try.
So I said, yes, it's very simple. You have to suture 2 vessels, and yes, I accept to do that. But where? What about the procurement of the kidney? So I said, there's no choice. We have to go at the prison of La Santé. I telephoned to the director of the prison to ask whether or not they had in the near future some death penalty. He said yes. Well, I said, could I take his kidneys? Yes, yes, no doubt. He will be dead, no head, you can take the kidneys.
C'était véritablement une aventure un peu dramatique parce que nous prélevions le rein au début chez des sujets qui avaient été suppliciés, guillotinés. Et c'était une atmosphère extrêmement pénible. Il fallait assister tout de suite presque à l'exécution. Le corps était préparé, transporté dans une salle à côté. Moi, je n'aurais pas eu le cœur assez bien accroché pour faire ça.
Even when the kidney was in good condition, and the surgery flawless, the transplants failed because of rejection, just as they had in Boston. Pessimism began to set in, and enthusiasm dwindled. What had begun as an attempt to save badly burned airmen with skin grafts had apparently ended in failure. Kidneys, no more than skin, would survive the immunological barrier of the individual. Yet surgeons knew of one rare exception in nature to this rule: identical twins. Skin had been successfully grafted between such twins, and if skin could be, why not a kidney?
One kidney can function perfectly normally. 1 in 1,000 persons is born with only one kidney, and maybe in a group of 100 people, there's probably one person that only has one kidney. There's no way of knowing unless you happen to have had a renal study. There have been many instances of an athlete or somebody having loss of their kidney through an accident and find out it's an only kidney at that time. But one kidney can function perfectly normally.
In 1954, Richard Herrick came to the Brigham dying of renal disease. What made him special was that he had a perfectly healthy twin brother, Ronald, with 2 healthy kidneys, one of which he could spare. With no immunological barrier to defeat them, the team set out to do the first kidney transplant using a living donor. The kidney was to be placed not in the thigh, but in the pelvis. The crucial operation was set for December 23rd, 1954.
Within 10 seconds, urine began to pour out the ureter. The patient had a lot of extra fluid on board, so he was urinating copiously all over the field, coming down onto the floor. We had to get the nurses to mop it up until we connected the ureter and put it into the bladder. Of course, now that's commonplace. We expect kidneys to function, but this was a first, and it was very exciting. Within, a week, he looked like a new person, and we couldn't believe the transformation that occurred. Every operation prior to this was obviously weighing the good and the bad for the individual involved. But to take out a normal kidney from a normal, healthy person for the benefit of somebody else was totally unheard of. And there was no point in going to a library because you knew that nobody ever had done it in the world.
How does it feel to have 3 kidneys? Any different?
No, it feels no different at all.
Well, Ronald, how does it feel to have 1?
I can't see any difference.
As the hospital became famous, more identical twins came to them from all over the world. In the years that followed, the doctors at the Brigham presided over a gift of life from twin to twin. For identical twins, at least, the legend of Cosmas and Damien was coming true.
He said that my only hope would be that if I had an identical twin, and my husband said, well, that I did have one.
See, we weren't real sure we were identical at the time, but we went up and had those skin grafts and things like that after they found out about me being there. and that's when they discovered we weren't identical.
Yeah, they said that we'd have to go to Boston because that's the only place they did it at that time, and that she could give me a kidney.
And they came to us in May or the spring of 1956. She was dying of renal disease, and she was being kept alive on the artificial kidney. Her sister was perfectly normal as far as the sister knew, and was very willing to give the kidney. Both had been recently married, only about 3 months married. So we did the operation. It worked beautifully. She went back to Oklahoma, and we've kept in touch. But persons with renal disease, women with renal disease, develop irregular menstrual periods. Their hormones are all kilter. So she didn't realize that she was pregnant until she was about 3 or 4 months pregnant.
I really didn't know that I was for a while. And when I went to the doctor, they said, yeah, that I was. So my doctor here called Dr. Murray in Boston. He said, we'll have to have her come back out here. Said she can't have it there because they want to watch me. So I went back out there in January and stayed until John was born in March.
We did a cesarean section as a precaution because I wanted to put my fingers down and feel if the baby's head was really impinging on the kidney. And I realized then that she could have had a normal delivery, although I wasn't sorry that we had been careful about it. But she was the first person who ever received a kidney transplant who subsequently had a normal baby.
Edith Helm went on to have more children and grandchildren, yet the doctors in Boston knew that all they had achieved was a small victory. Successful kidney transplantation was confined to the tiny world of identical twins. For everybody else, an immunological barrier still stood in the way of medical progress. There was just a ray of hope. Peter Medawar had found a small weakness in the immunological barrier. Normally, a white and a brown mouse will reject skin grafts from one another. But Medawar reasoned things might be different at birth. Into one of a newborn litter of brown mice, he injected a solution of cells from the blood of a white mouse. Now, when the brown mouse grew up, a skin graft from that same white mouse was accepted. The barrier had been broken.
They showed that the newborn fetus, that is the newborn young, or just before birth, was what was called a privileged receptor. That individual, a tiny little baby mouse or rat, if they were working in the laboratory, dog or kitten, that little animal could accept skin from other donors. It was as if the immunologic system hadn't fully developed yet. So it showed that there were things about the biology of this rejection response that might be understood and might be overcome.
For his pioneering work, Medawar was to receive the Nobel Prize. But did this phenomenon, which he called immunological tolerance, have any possible application to organ transplantation? Was there a practical way of breaching the barrier? In practice, only one way was known of inducing immunological tolerance, and it was horrible. In Hiroshima, it had been noticed that the survivors' immune systems were wiped out by radiation. Surgeons reasoned that if patients were exposed to a non-fatal dose of radiation, they might then accept a kidney transplant. But radiation had awful side effects.
Well, that renders the patient very desperately ill, just because of the radiation has damaged everything. The whole of the immune system, the bowel lining, and many other tissues in the body. So it was a very violent treatment, which had almost no success in treating patients for grafts, for kidney grafts.
In that period between 1954 and 1962, we did several patients with whole body irradiation. And of course that makes us think of the atomic bomb survivors, Hiroshima. It makes us think of the terrible burden of whole body radiation. It does inhibit immunology. And it's interesting that we had some patients who almost made it, but they didn't. They died.
Radiation damaged the entire immune system, and patients were laid wide open to infection. A method had to be found which targeted only the part of the immune response involved in kidney rejection. And again, it was in a war that a clue was found. A horrible weapon used in the First World War, mustard gas, had attracted the attention of cancer researchers, who noticed that it could control the proliferation of white blood cells in leukemia. Research led to a series of anti-cancer drugs. And in 1959, a report appeared showing that one of these drugs, azathioprine, also suppressed the immune response. Perhaps a drug could successfully breach the barrier where everything else had failed. When azathioprine was given to dogs who had received a kidney transplant, it prevented rejection much better than radiation. Working together in Boston, Roy Calne and Joseph Murray began to have greater and greater success, with dogs first surviving for weeks, then months, and then over a year. Murray prepared to try it out on humans.
We only use kidneys, which would otherwise be thrown away. And we only use recipients who would otherwise die. And the first 2 patients we transplanted died with functioning kidneys, but they died of toxicity of the drug. And the 3rd patient we used, with about a quarter of the expected dose, that 3rd patient survived with a cadaveric transplant. And he survived for over 1 year. We published him in the New England Journal of Medicine in June of 1963. And that was the key article that started transplantation on a worldwide basis.
Thus, the kidney became the first organ to be transplanted across the barrier, and these among the first to benefit. Now donor kidneys from accident victims could be rushed for transplanting. Improved immunosuppressant drugs and later tissue typing techniques steadily improved the chances of survival. Within a matter of years, a pioneering operation gradually passed into the mainstream of clinical medicine. If the barrier had been breached for the kidney, why not for other organs? By 1964, work was underway on livers, lungs, and the biggest prize of all, the human heart.
The heart still is different. The heart still got something magic about it. It's to do with the soul and with life and with all sorts of things. And there's never been quite the same cavalier attitude as there is to the kidney, which nobody really, it doesn't move, it doesn't do anything, and it's rather a boring organ.
Well, there's nothing glamorous about urine, you know. The heart has always been so much legend attached to it. There, you know, there have always been pictures of the heart, and the heart's supposed to be so central to, it's supposed to be, the whole personality was in the heart. Everybody thought for many, 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 many years. And it was almost unthinkable that you could take out a heart and replace it with another heart and have it work. That was really fantastic. Yes, it was understood that this could be done with kidneys. Attempts had been made with livers. Attempts had been made with lungs up to that time. But the heart has always been something special. And I think that's why heart surgeons also have this aura attached to them, because they are dealing with something in the eyes of the people, the community, is something special.
Heart surgeons knew very well how to repair a heart, but to take one out and replace it was fraught with danger.
It was very much more hazardous to contemplate because there was no way back. In the transplanting of a kidney, there was, in fact, the dialysis machine, the way that you could recover from a failure at operation. You could go back to something which would keep you alive. So one didn't feel that you were actually committing a patient to an absolutely clear death sentence if you fail to do this thing right.
Once that heart has been removed, then one is looking at a hole in the chest and something's got to be put there, or one is going to have to talk to the family. And so that is for one thing. The other thing is that the kidney does not have to function immediately well. For example, we put in a kidney, it may not function for 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the patient is supported with dialysis, and at the end of that time, the kidney starts working very nicely. Whereas with the heart, when those clamps are taken off and the patient is taken, and then later when the patient is taken off the heart-lung machine, then the heart has to work.
Heart surgeons were the kings of surgery. They were a breed apart.
Keep your hand out of my light. I can't see you. Keep putting your hand in front of me. You know, I see you do the same thing every day. Don't ever put your hand in front of my line of vision.
They had immense self-confidence based on a phenomenal record of success. Pioneers like Walt Lillehei had led a daring campaign on the heart, thought to be an impossible organ to operate on, and they had won. Virtually every defect could now be repaired. Artificial valves could replace damaged ones. Arteries could be replaced by synthetic substitutes. Now they wanted to replace the heart itself, and most American surgeons thought that the best way forward was to implant an artificial device. But a few surgeons were working instead towards a heart transplant. 2 graduates of the University of Minnesota, the mecca for aspiring heart surgeons in the 1950s, would become famous for this operation. The brilliant Norman Shumway and a keen visiting South African, Christian Barnard.
All right, well, we're ready?
Many problems had to be overcome before a heart could be transplanted, but by far the biggest problem facing the new heart transplanters was finding hearts to transplant. James Hardy became so frustrated seeing patient after patient die for lack of a human donor heart that in 1964 he went ahead and transplanted a chimpanzee's heart into a human patient. It survived less than 2 hours, and in a blaze of criticism, he quit the transplant field. But work went on in the laboratories, and by 1967, the highly respected Norman Shumway, who had done most of the scientific research, announced he was ready. He began his wait for a suitable human donor. In New York that same summer, Adrian Kantrowitz was on the verge of doing a transplant. He had a patient, but couldn't find a donor. Then in December 1967, with this tiny patient, his chance came again. He looked for a donor and prepared to do the first human heart transplant.
We had a recipient ready. We had the donor identified in Philadelphia, as a matter of fact. And that morning, my daughter came in and said some joker down in Africa has done a heart transplant.
Once we had the patient, we got into gear to get all the people involved in this on 24-hour standby. We realized that the donor would probably have to be a victim of a motor car accident. After investigating a few donors, Dr. M.C. Botha, who did the matching and the blood grouping, decided that a young woman of 23 seriously injured in a motor car accident would be the best donor. When she died, she was put on a heart-lung machine, and then her heart was removed. When we found that the heart was suitable, the patient was also put on the heart-lung machine. His heart was taken out, and her heart was then transplanted. I think a cheer went up in the operating theater when we gave the heart a shock, and it started.
His patient was Louis Wishkansky. For the first time, a transplanted human heart beat inside the chest of a human being.
Christian Neethling Barnard, Associate Professor of Surgery at Cape Town University, the man who transplants human hearts, gets ready to meet the British press. 4.5 hours ago, he stepped off a flight from New York. Now, in a hotel room near London Airport, he prepares to talk once again about his work. Work that in the space of a few weeks has made him an internationally recognized figure. It will be his 19th press conference in 5 days. Everybody wants to talk to this man. The President of the United States invited him home for the day. The Mayor of New York gave him a reception. His own university, Cape Town, conferred its highest honor on him, a gold medal and the degree of Doctor of Science. The French sent him a life-sized human heart in solid gold. Since 5 o'clock on December the 3rd, when he completed the first human heart transplant operation in the history of medicine, life for the 46-year-old professor hasn't been the same.
You wouldn't believe this. I mean, I woke up, when I finished the transplant in the night, I said to my brother who was with me, I said, you know, we better tell somebody in the hospital that we've done a heart transplant tonight. So I phoned what we call the superintendent, the head of the hospital, and told him that we did the transplant. In fact, he was quite annoyed that I woke him up so early in the morning, until I told him it was not on an animal, but it was on a human. When I left the hospital that morning, it was early hours of the morning, it was summer and the sun was just rising. There was not one photographer, not one television camera, not one reporter outside that hospital.
I must say I was disappointed because we were all set to go. Everything was all set to go. It was just a matter of luck who got the donor and the recipient together first. I knew Chris Barnard, and after the initial shock, I said to myself, this is ridiculous. I mean, just because he has done it, there's no reason for me not to do it. So that we continued with our plans, and we did our first heart transplant 2 or 3 days, I guess 3 days after he did his. And this initiated a tremendous media response.
Story in the Sunday Express that says there's a Mr. Blaber, the dentist, here at Hamburg.
But most of the attention was centered on Christian Barnard, an unknown South African surgeon who was already preparing to do a second transplant. For American heart surgeons used to the limelight, it was hard to take.
Oh, of course I was envious because I felt that, well, I didn't begrudge him having done it, but I was annoyed, frankly, that we had not done it in this country because certainly Dr. Shumway's group had readily could have done it, and at least 4 or 5 groups in this country could have done it.
I think there was a disappointment in the sense that all of the experimental, literally all of the experimental work had been done in the United States, and that we felt in our group that it would have been nice if it were an American who had done it first.
It was quite amazing. I don't know why the people in the United States expected the transplant to be done here, because there were centers all over the world ready to do it and as capable as the surgeons in the United States. And it really amazed me very much. I was present at meetings where senior surgeons got up and stated that I stole the technique from Shumway and that I should never have been the first one to do the transplant. Well, you know, I mean, there's no such thing as a single genius. We get ideas from everybody, and I do admit that I got ideas from Shumway, especially in the diagnosis of rejection. But as far as the surgical technique is concerned, as I pointed out, the man who first described it was Sir Russell Brock in the Guy's Hospital Gazette. And we then changed it and modified the technique slightly, and that is the technique that's used today. So actually, they did not contribute towards the surgical technique that's presently used. The other thing that was that was quite funny is that our initial results were better than the results they obtained here in their clinics.
Barnard's first patient lasted 18 days. The powerful drugs given to try to suppress rejection weakened him, and he died of pneumonia. But Kantrowitz's patient died after only 6 hours. The next American to try was the man Barnard had upstaged, Norman Shumway. As the acknowledged leader in the field, how had he reacted to Barnard's triumph?
In fact, I remember my first communication with him was to tell him how to make the diagnosis of rejection of the heart, because I think they had very little information at that time. As a matter of fact, they had no animal work to back them up. So they needed to rely entirely on what had been done in the research laboratories around here.
Were you disappointed?
Not really, no. I'll tell you one thing that was very good about it, and that is that first of all, I didn't realize it would attract so much attention. I thought that was quite ridiculous, but I thought it was a good idea that attention was directed elsewhere, so that when we did our transplant a few weeks later, it was just very calm, and there was not all the problems associated with the press.
But despite Shumway's experience, after 15 days, his patient weakened and died. Meanwhile, Barnard had tried again.
After the death of Mr. Wisconski, I went to my second patient because I wanted him to know everything. In fact, I went after about an hour after Mr. Wisconski's death, and I said to him, look, I said, I want to be honest with you. We've done the first patient, and the patient's died. In fact, I told him that the patient died. He didn't even know that. And I said to him, but we feel that we've learned a lot, and I think that we can perform this operation and offer you something. He said, doctor, he says, when do you want to operate?
On January the 2nd, 1968, Barnard transplanted a heart into a dentist, Dr. Philip Bleiberg, and this time the press was everywhere.
And how long did the operation take?
I don't know how long the operation took. I've got no clue when I even started. I really don't know when or how long. You can ask Dr. Zinski, the anesthetist, because he's got the times.
And what is the patient's condition now?
Very well.
Bleiberg would live for over a year and a half. For many patients, he became a symbol of hope. While he lived, heart transplants had credibility, and any criticisms that were made were overcome by the pressure of patients wanting to have a similar operation done on them.
Thank you, sir. May I speak to your patient? And of course we will respect your identity, sir, but may I ask what your reaction has been to what you have heard Professor Barnard say tonight and what has been said?
I've followed Professor Barnard through the whole business, and I've been thrilled because I've been waiting since 1962 to live a life which I hope a new heart is going to give me. Yes. What he has done for a chap in South Africa can be done for me. I can become a new man, I can live a life instead of this.
All over the world, patients were asking for the new operation. Even the cautious British jumped on the bandwagon.
This is the team that yesterday performed Britain's first human heart transplant operation.
Of course there was great euphoria, because here this was a great leap forward. When it worked very well. And the hope was very high that this was a solution to a problem which was enormous. And there was enormous media response, even for the second and third and fourth heart transplants. And there was television programs at night talking about heart transplants, and it was in Time magazine, and it was everywhere. And pretty soon it got to be that if you didn't do a heart transplant, you weren't a real heart surgeon. And so, therefore, everybody who wanted to be a real heart surgeon started to do it, including some very real heart surgeons, like Mike DeBakey and like Denton Cooley, whose experience followed some 4 or 5 months later.
Mike DeBakey and Denton Cooley worked in Houston, Texas, the heart capital of the world. It was to the Methodist Hospital that the rich and famous came to have their hearts mended. They came to be treated by Michael DeBakey, known by his colleagues as the Texas Tornado. Michael DeBakey had a brilliant younger assistant, Denton Cooley. Many thought him more technically skilled than his master. Some said the best in the world. Dazzlingly fast, he could complete in minutes operations that would take other surgeons hours. Together they made a great team. And in May 1968, Cooley extended the range of things they offered in Houston with a transplant on Everett Thomas, the first of dozens he would do. Patients would flock to him, much as they had to Barnard in South Africa, and they spoke openly of their gratitude.
Dr. Cooley is the man with the golden hand, the only man with the golden hand.
He gave my husband life.
Louis Fierro returned to work selling cars. When patients crippled by heart failure saw scenes like this, they wanted a chance as well. Their enthusiasm drove the revolution that Barnard had started. DeBakey was initially cool towards heart transplants. He had long believed that an artificial heart was the way to go and had already implanted simple devices to assist an ailing heart. But on the 31st of August that year, he joined the bandwagon in flamboyant style. In one session, he transplanted a heart, both kidneys, and one lung into 4 different recipients. In the months that followed, more heart transplants were done in Houston than anywhere else in the world. By now, the man who had started it all, Barnard, was an international celebrity, courted by presidents and movie stars.
I was totally unprepared for this. I was just an ordinary doctor who grew up in the country of South Africa, and all of a sudden I was asked to discuss anything from ginger cakes to atomic energy. I had to answer every question, political questions, medical questions, invited to parties. Nobody told me, don't get photographed with this woman, get photographed with that woman. I come in too, they say to me, look, you know this girl, she's a famous actress, and would you like to meet her? Of course I'd like to meet her. And then they said, do you mind to take a picture with her? A picture taken with her. All of a sudden it was big news, you know, that I had an affair with this girl. So people often criticized me for what I did. But they must remember that I was never educated, prepared for the situation I was put in overnight.
Did you enjoy it?
Of course, I enjoyed it very much. I love to meet people, I love to be with people. I tell you something, I really enjoyed it.
But as the year ran on, these surgical triumphs proved short-lived. Patients died, sometimes of rejection. Sometimes because the powerful drugs given to overcome rejection laid them open to infections. And there was no sign that the results were getting any better. Barnard, once the world's hero, was now in the front line.
Well,
62 days ago, a new phrase hit the world headlines: heart transplant. At Groote Hospital in Cape Town, the world's first surgical operation to transplant a human heart was performed by a surgeon virtually unknown except to a handful of other surgeons. After the praise came the criticism. At first, it was no more than a murmur. Today, it can be heard round the world. Heart swapping is direct killing, Vatican. As well as secular and religious protests, there were those which came from medicine itself. Soon it became clear that the medical world was divided. In spite of further heart transplant operations in other parts of the world, that gulf grows wider each day. The split is widest of all in Britain. Tonight in London, before a gathering of doctors, lawyers, churchmen and journalists, Professor Barnard meets some of his critics.
I have here the issue of the South African Medical Journal of December 30th, which is entirely devoted to your first operation. There's a paper here by yourself. It's entitled A Human Cardiac Transplant, an interim report of a successful operation performed at Groote Hospital, Cape Town. In the front of the editorial, ringed in black, are these words: "We regret to record the death of the patient, Mr. Louis Wyshonsky, on the 21st of December 1967. In the editorial, it is written, the claim successful can be used even at this early stage, because to date it is a feat which makes medical history, no matter how short the further survival of the patient might be." Do you agree with that?
Well, you notice we didn't say a completely successful heart transplant.
You didn't say completely successful. You just said
a successful heart transplant.
What difference?
Now, in early transplantation surgery of the kidney, and in early open heart...
In the audience were men like Roy Cohn, who had slowly and methodically pioneered kidney transplants in the 1950s. They felt that the heart transplanters, Barnard included, had launched into the surgery more or less ignoring the problem of tissue rejection.
Well, it wasn't a question of understanding it. They denied its existence, which made it much easier. They had a religious faith that if they did the operation, well, there would be no rejection. But of course, heart transplant is a straightforward, relatively easy operation for any good cardiac surgeon. And there were hundreds all over the world that did heart transplants, imagining that all they needed to do was make one phone call to the people doing kidney grafting, or not even bother with that.
You were dealing with a medical world that had now become accustomed to transplantation. Furthermore, you were dealing with a whole cohort of very experienced, very expert cardiac surgeons. And what happened was that many cardiac surgeons, some of whom might be regarded as not having had all that much experience with any kind of transplantation, let alone immunosuppressive chemotherapy, started to do a lot of heart transplantations about 1968, and in some places 100% of the patients died.
But despite the controversy, many heart surgeons continued. Foremost among them was Denton Cooley. His enthusiasm for the new operation grew each time he did a transplant.
I don't know, I have a feeling of exhilaration, I'm sure. I feel like I've accomplished something. That I've taken a man who was at death's door and given him a chance for a new life, and I can't wait to see him again to see what this new pump will do for him. I think it'll renovate his old carcass, and we'll have a new man. It certainly would not be on my conscience if this man lived only a week, because I don't think he would have lived a week had we not done it. So anything we can give him is a bonus to him.
Yet the heart transplant pioneers had another problem: how to keep the patients alive before the operation. Many of Cooley's very sick patients died waiting for a donor heart. There was no way to keep them going temporarily if their hearts failed. The early kidney transplanters had had a machine to help them, the artificial kidney invented by Willem Kolff during the war. Although crude, it could take over the functions of the kidney for a time while the patient waited for a donor kidney. No such device existed to keep a heart transplant patient alive, only crude prototypes which had been tested in DeBakey's lab. DeBakey wasn't ready to use them on humans, but Denton Cooley, his assistant, was less reticent. Cooley had always been in DeBakey's shadow. Now, however, since joining the revolution in heart transplant surgery that Barnard had initiated, he became a public figure in his own right. This led to rivalry. What happened next was an extraordinary tale of medical conflict, dubbed by Life magazine, the Battle of the Texas Tornado versus Dr. Wonderful. In April 1969, Cooley had a desperately ill patient, Haskell Karp, who without a transplant would die within hours. But no donor could be found. With DeBakey out of town in Washington, Cooley decided that the only hope was to use an experimental artificial heart to tide Mr. Karp over until a donor could be found. Without asking DeBakey's permission, without telling the hospital, without consulting the National Institutes of Health, which had funded DeBakey's research, Cooley went ahead. For the first time in history, an artificial heart beat inside the body of a human being. Cooley announced his triumph to the press.
We are most encouraged by our results so far, and even if Mr. Karp doesn't go any more than another day, I think that we have demonstrated that there is validity to this concept of making every effort to prolong life at any cost in order to make possible a cardiac transplantation.
Everybody knew it was only a temporary solution, and so a search was mounted nationwide for a donor heart for Mr. Karp. 2.5 days after the operation, Mrs. Karp went on television with this appeal.
Someone somewhere, please hear my plea. A plea for a heart for my husband. I see him lying there, breathing, and knowing that within his chest is a man-made implement where there should be a God-given heart. How long can he survive? One can only guess. I cry without tears. I wait hopefully. Our children wait hopefully, and we pray. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh. Maybe somewhere there is a gift of a heart for my husband. Please.
A donor was found, but 2 days after the transplant, Karp died of pneumonia. DeBakey, who had heard about the artificial heart experiment secondhand in Washington, was furious. Cooley had violated ethical and legal requirements. He had not asked permission from the hospital to try what was essentially an experimental procedure. Cooley subsequently resigned from DeBakey's hospital. It is said that the two have not spoken to each other since. In the scandal that followed, Karp's widow later tried unsuccessfully to sue Cooley for experimenting on her husband. Only 2 years after Barnard's triumphant operation, the heart transplant program lay in tatters. What had appeared as a miraculous life-saving operation had turned into a nightmare. Controlling tissue rejection for hearts was, it seemed, much trickier than for kidneys. By 1971, of 170 transplants, all but 24 were dead. Eventually, even the strongest advocate of the operation, the brilliant Denton Cooley, announced that he was going to quit the transplant business.
It seems to me that as a surgeon, I've gone almost as far as I can go with this technique. I'm not an immunologist, a basic scientist, and we are dependent upon them to support these patients once the operation has been done.
Heart surgeons everywhere who had promoted the operation admitted defeat.
It was not merely the surgical procedure. It was not like putting in a valve. This was really quite different. That the biology of the system, the immunology of the system, was really the hard part. And our own group decided not to pursue it any further because we were not set up. I was not the right person to work out those kind of problems. We were the right kind of people to work out mechanical devices, but not really the subtleties of the immunology of the problem.
Only one American surgeon continued, the highly respected Norman Shumway. Throughout the 1970s, he would build a team of scientists and doctors to tackle the problem of tissue rejection in a careful, scientific manner. For other American surgeons, referrals for heart transplants just dried up.
Well, the patients all died, you see. And that's often, there aren't many things right about the American system of medicine, but one of them that's right is when the patients don't survive or do well, the referrals will stop.
Ultimately, Shumway's methodical ways would transform heart transplants, but not until surgery itself would undergo a period of soul-searching and change. Next time on Nova, from artificial hearts to cancer surgery, surgeons have to defend their actions to an increasingly critical public.
This is not dealing with a boil, we're dealing with a killing cancer. And this whole business has really been blown up in the press, completely out of context with reality.
Oh, nonsense.
Beyond the Knife, next time on Nova.
And next time for the continuation of the series on the history of surgery and that brutal craft. It'll be next Tuesday evening, 8 to 9 o'clock here on Channel 9. And next this evening, The Struggles for Poland, recounting the history of this century for Polish history, focuses tonight on the influence of the Catholic Church and also tonight on the importance of solidarity in labor unions. That'll be tonight between 9 and 11 o'clock. And then Regular Lives is a look at the integration of persons with handicaps into schools, work, and community life. And that'll be at 11 o'clock tonight, narrated by Martin Sheen. By the way, tonight's Nova about organ transplants will be shown again Saturday at noon. And tomorrow evening, we go live to Lincoln Center. At that time tomorrow night, we present Verity's A Rigoletto with Beverly Sills as our host in a production led by Tito Capobianco.